Good afternoon, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Welcome to today's webinar on systemic change and ESG, hosted on behalf of ESG Africa Conference and Expo and sponsored by EY. This webinar will explore how systemic change can help your work as an ESG practitioner. It's become apparent in today's complex and interconnected world that working in silos no longer gives us the transformative change we need. It's critical to look holistically at issues, understand all the moving parts, and co-create solutions that take the relevant ecosystem into consideration, which is particularly important in Africa. Our panelists will unpack how systemic change can enhance your ESG efforts, the pitfalls to avoid, and key lessons to learn. Before we start, please note that the chat and the Q&A are available to you. Please post your questions in the Q&A and your comments in the chat. Both the Q&A and the chat are at the bottom of your screen. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar and will send the recording to you when it's available. We are also streaming the webinar live on YouTube and we'll share the link in the chat. I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Wendy Poulton. She's the Director of Strategic Mindsets, a company specializing in strategy and risk consulting and coaching. She's also the co-founder of the ESG Africa Conference and Expo. Wendy will facilitate the discussion with today's panel, which consists of Marie Paramon-Gurney, CEO and Chief Transformation Impact Officer at Sculpture, Sharon van Skalkwyk, Executive Director at Ubuntu Lab Institute, and Nicola White, Strategy and Transaction Sustainability at EY Parthenon. I'll hand over now to moderator Wendy Poulton to start the discussion. Over to you, Wendy.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon, and welcome to everybody. It's my great pleasure to facilitate this panel because it really is one of my passions. I've had over 25 years in sustainability and, as Shannon said, strategy and risk as well. And the more that you work in these fields together with people who are their own, the people that drive systemic change, the more you realize that unless we take a systemic view on today's extremely fast-changing and uncertain VUCA world that we live in, we're not going to be able to implement all of those great things that we come up with in strategy. And so it really is a critical issue for something like ESG, which is got to be integrated into that particular system. So we're very lucky to have the panel that we have today to discuss these things, who also share my passion for this topic. And I think we're going to jump right into it and ask the first question, which is, we know that systemic change is important for ESG for the reasons that I just mentioned, but why is it so important for Africa in particular that we look at things from a systemic point of view? So, Marie, I will start with you.
Thank you, Wendy, and really, like, it's a privilege to be in this webinar. As you know, it's also one of my passions: system change and transformative approach to sustainability. And I think to me, there is two reasons about why is it important for Africa. The first reason is in terms of our development path, and if we want to make sure that our development path address various consideration, economic growth or development, resilience of that economic growth, first of all, but also the inclusive social development and the regenerative approach to our natural capital, and to make sure that we do it in an innovative way and really optimize on the different aspects of our development from a social and environmental perspective. The only way to do it is to look at it from a system change perspective. Everything is connected. And what I found a way to explain it really well is if you look at agriculture. Agriculture is about food system, it's about survival of people, but it's also about economic growth, it's also about economic development, it's about infrastructure, it's about banking, it's about insurance, it's about health, it's about nutrition, it's about so many things. And so if you only look at it from one aspect, then you can't optimize opportunity from a business, from an ESG perspective, and you can't really develop an ESG approach that is actually adding all the value together. So to me, it's a non-brainer, and it's the only way to look at it from a business perspective.
Thank you. Nicola.
Yes.
Your thoughts on this?
On systemic change in Africa. What is
Yes.
really
Why is it
interesting,
important specifically for Africa?
yeah, what is really interesting about it is that Africans are often quite early on in their ESG journeys. That requires you to come into a company and really educate everybody what it's about. We're building dynamic flow models so they can understand how the supply chain may impact the rest of the business and how it's eventually going to work through from an operations perspective, dealing with all your waste and your biodiversity, all the way up into revenue generation. But what is critical now is all the funding coming into Africa from Europe has to abide by the SFDR regulations. And these regulations are quite tough. They require enormous reporting standards that are very well aligned to TCFD and GRI and all the SASB related things. So looking at how Africans can embrace them, you have to look at it from a systemic approach, because nobody wants to sort of put ESG activities in place that are just compliance driven. They have to be value accretive. Now, you can't create the value or understand the value creation opportunities without understanding its impact throughout the organization, throughout the income statement and the balance sheet, and the cultural perspective of what's needed to embrace and adopt these new activities and principles. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I think you raised a really important point there around making sure that the change is linked to not only regulation and those kinds of changes that are happening, but to value creation in the organization. And so without doing it systemically, you're going to miss some opportunities because you're looking at things from too narrow a perspective. And so thanks for raising that. And, you know, for me, it's also really, really critical in Africa that if you don't take a systemic approach, you miss out on the social side, which is the most important thing in Africa: social upliftment, poverty alleviation, all of those issues as well. So that's a different kind of value that you're mentioning there as well. Nicola, Sharon, do you want to add anything on this point before we go on to the next question?
Thanks, Wendy. I'll be short. Just speaking from the perspective of Ubuntu Lab's work and the Presencing Institute, which is all about systems change. And the thought, looking at it from the iceberg way, as we often have an iceberg thing to explain many things, what we see at the above is not what is causing what we see. So everything, the reality that is at the top, and we continuously create systems that deliver what we don't want. We don't get up in the morning to decide to create chaos, but we have created chaos. And below the surface are the structures and the systems that is creating our reality. And unless we go into the systems and understand what is feeding that, we can't really change our reality. And I think for you talking about the different systems, really, we looking at environment, so the whole ecological divide, the social divide that you've just mentioned now, the fact of the inequality that exists. And I think why specifically Africa, we've got a slightly additional element to looking at our systems, is the impact on just our Africanness because of colonization and what's come to us through patriarchy and unfortunately also religions, where the identity of Africans, we've lost that, don't know who we are, and we've adopted systems that in Africa, across the continent, that are not ours. It's not the way Africans indigenously lived, including with nature as well. So the concept of Ubuntu including nature. So the whole systems, looking at the systems in Africa, has got that slight extra element of which of these systems actually belong to us and what has caused some of the chaos, because it's not the way we operate, and it's created some of the stuff that we don't want.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I think that was really insightful around, it's not just one system, it's lots of interlinked systems. And oftentimes when we do the analysis, we've got to be careful that we don't, because you can just go broader and broader, right? So it's focusing in on what are the things that, as Nicola said, are really going to create the value for you as an organization. So thank you for that. So I'd like us to then sort of move on to where some examples that we've got in Africa where we've applied this type of systemic approach, really analyzed the system and got benefit from doing that. So we can help the people on this webinar to understand some of the hows. How do you actually do this? It sounds very complicated, but it's not really when you get to understand it. So what are some great examples that we've got there? So Sharon, I'll start with you because you also, and if you could, just touch a little bit on some of the skills that you need to do this as part of that how.
Thank you, Wendy. Yes, I think I will, from our perspective, we work very much on the personal how. I think Maria and Nicola might have better examples from the bigger systems. Because the systems need to change from below and above. There's definitely the systems that keep things out of, like keeping people out of the market. So let me give you a small, very practical example in Zambia, where the banking system, well, it's an African thing, where the banking system really keeps people out of the system if they don't have assets. If you don't have an asset, you can't really borrow. So in Zambia, some women got together and they started a village bank, which is fairly much what we would understand as a stokvel. But in their system, it's just, again, saving together, but then people have to borrow so that it creates a financial system and growing within that sort of context. I think another good example, trying to think now of the practical ones that are maybe slightly bigger level, is one of our groups in Uganda has decided to tackle integrity as a value in the country's system. So they've got together and they are meeting with government and being involved with bringing integrity into all the pieces of work that they do, into working with school children, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be working within the systems, can be at very low levels, but creating a different way of being. Another quick example are the experiences of women of not getting good service from service providers. So in this one community, they've created a Facebook group where they post all women service providers and all other companies that are gender sensitive in providing service. So, that kind of idea could be replicated in all sorts of aspects. So these are like examples are now from, community type systems, and how we start bringing to reality things based on values that are more sustainable or more nourishing and more of the kind of thing that we want for our future.
Thank you, Sharon, for those examples. Nicola, did you have others that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk very broadly and don't want to mention any particular client. But all of us sitting on this webinar, we all understand what E, S, and G are. Data is clearly everything when trying to measure and understand what's important for your ESG. We all understand you can't do everything. You need to find out what your material factors are and focus on those. But what's deeper and even better beyond that is you're looking at systemic factors like, do you have strategic resilience embedded in how you've designed your governance systems? Are you looking at your IT and your data security to understand what they need to do to be flexible and adaptable and adopt some of the ESG principles or activities you want to be in. Then you've got to look at your financial structures. How are you organizing your financial and your operational structures and assets in order to really understand how all of those must get the agility they need, how you are devolving power and data gathering responsibilities down to people on the floor so that you can gather everybody into this entire structure of ESG and creating value. It all has to be tied together. The cyber, the operational, the financial, the strategic, the governance structures, get them to work in a management system that empowers people, that teaches people what they're trying to do, that you really need to teach them how what data points, what the value is in the data point. Does it really matter that I'm measuring this particular data point unless you educate them what the analytical value of that data point is for, let's say, third parties or for their own business? It's very difficult to really pull the value out. Now, everybody really is looking at ESG as it's a compliance thing and it's a cost thing. The only way we are going to generate a groundswell of acceptance is by proving that it's value accretive. And therefore, you need to look at it in a far bigger way than just E, S, and G. Look at all the bits and pieces that go into it from a systemic or a business-wide perspective. Essentially, that's my example. And that's how we tend to approach all the companies we're looking at, whether it's right from the beginning on the gap analysis, what you're missing, or benchmarking them. But you need to establish a rapport with your companies that you're working with in order to understand the nuts and bolts of their operations and how they actually function so that you can fit ESG activities into it seamlessly and pull as much value as you can out. Thanks.
Nicola, can I push you a little bit? You said sort of some of the major learnings. What in your experience have you seen that hasn't worked? What didn't work and what can we learn from that? What have people tried in the way that they implement systemic thinking and then it's been a miserable failure, so we know what to avoid?
So often people find it really, really hard to give up power, to allow an additional, lower levels in the organization to say these people actually have the on-the-ground knowledge of what is happening with a manufacturing plant. How often are you talking to them? Do you believe what they're saying? So creating forums, so that is difficult to do, to devolve power downwards. What is also quite difficult to do is to change, governance structures that have been operational for like 20 years. How do you help companies understand that the kind of things they're doing are maybe not working in the best way possible? So anything that involves change to a system, as in any system, takes time and effort to implement. And, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Those are the biggest learnings. It's change, and it's trying to get, let's say, executive management to understand the change and not take it as a knock to their ego when you suggest that they maybe they can consider it looking at the other way. Because if you want to get buy-in, you have to get executive management to back you all the way through, even if that involves, difficult for things for management to accept. That's the hard side of it.
Thank you. I think that's great information for people as well. I mean, I think certainly you have to get buy-in at the upper levels, but you also have to get buy-in at the lower levels where you're implementing the issues. So what you're saying about, right throughout the organization is so important. And that co-creation that Shannon was talking about right in the beginning, which gets buy-in as well. So I think one of the things I've seen people not do very well is consult with people and get that buy-in early on and use that co-creation. In our last session that Marie facilitated in our community of practice, we were talking about the power of co-creation and how important it is. So Marie, you've already mentioned one example on agriculture. Do you have any others that you think will help us? And I know at the community of practice next week, we're going to delve a lot more into the how and some of the practicalities around that. But any other examples of where you've really seen this working in Africa?
So I think where there's been an attempt for it, it started as an environmental issue. So everyone is aware about our plastic challenge. So that became like more a visual thing. It was there. There was a strong policy and a regulatory framework. So there was a lot of push from the NGO, but there also was an understanding we're facing a problem around plastic. And then in South Africa context and in many other African context, there was a regulatory push with what we call the extended responsibility, producer responsibility. But what happened with that is, so you have the compliance push, but then is how do we make it work? Because it's one thing to say you are responsible for the plastics that you produce throughout the life cycle, but that's where you need to understand that that's where system change approach become really important, because you can't save that issue on your own. Plastic is all entire supply chain. And also when you position it in African context, there is all secondary economies that rely on the current context. So there was a very strong intentionality with the role player when the legislation was coming to say, how do we organize ourselves? And so there was a lot of thinking about mapping the system, understanding who is involved, who is doing what are the gaps. And I think one of the big elements of this was to spend and have a bit more time. And I'm not saying that's a perfect example, but it was a try at it to say, do we understand the problem? Because it's one thing to say we have a plastic problem. It's another thing to say, why do we have it? And where are the different points of intervention where we can achieve the objective of reducing plastic waste? And so there were different avenues to change and to address the issue, which was for minimizing, reducing, looking at technology innovation, looking at collaboration, but also looking at the whole social aspect of it. And that became something really big in South Africa. So we had different stakeholders, and that's where your co-creation become really important, Wendy, is bringing everyone to really have a diverse perspective of the problem, to then be able to say, okay, these are the options. And then it was like, how do I experiment? Because one of the things that we do often in ESG is we're very quick to jump to the solution. We're like, oh, we have a water issue. We have a plastic issue. This is a solution. And it's A to B. It's a straight line. Well, I think we all there on this call able to say, well, if that was that simple, we will not be here and we will not be having this discussion, and it will not be such a big issue. Because when you speak about environmental issue, you're actually talking about economic market. And so it was I think the plastic discussion that has taken place in South Africa, and it's not, we haven't sorted it out, but the discussion that took place were completely different. And I think another example where you saw that was the self-created ecosystem of company during COVID. I think that's really where we saw and a remarkable attempt to say we're having a problem and take really a lot of time to experiment, not knowing exactly how and creating that space for experimentation to address a social challenge. And I think that was and the beauty of system change, which is a nightmare for company, is system change is about experimenting, failing, learning, and going again. So the IT guys understand this. We have not got that narrative in sustainability. We think that we need to have that solution and it has to work, and that's it.
Thank you. Those are great examples. And I think that causality that you're talking about as well really helps you understand that system and what's driving it, and not just focusing on the outcomes, but the real root cause that you were mentioning there as well. And that's a very nice segue into the next thing I want to discuss, which is around the stakeholder analysis, which all of you have mentioned in different parts of your responses. And the fact that this systemic change normally, I mean, doesn't have to, but for big things, it's managing stakeholders not only internally, but also externally to your organization, on your supply chain, regulators, local communities, all of those kinds of things as well. So if we're going to take this approach of systemic change to be more resilient, as Nicola was saying, how do we need to change the way in which we identify and engage with our stakeholders? So, Marie, can I start with you on that one?
Yeah, but I need to control myself because this is obviously my passion. So
I know, that's why I asked you to go first.
But I will. And I think it's also understanding why do you engage with stakeholders, first of all, and be very, 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 very transparent about it. If you just want to consult with them, say we just want to consult with them. But if you authentically want to start a co-creation process to really enrich and take a system approach to your ESG, that's a completely different process. And you need to understand what it means. And I think Nicola mentioned about power. And so first of all, you need to understand who are your stakeholders, as you mentioned, Wendy. And that mapping is not about, oh, this is our client, this is our, obviously you do the normal, but it's about who's got influence and power, what are their interests, how do you impact on them, but how do they impact on you? What are their pain and their gain through what you're doing, your services, your product, but also your presence in the landscape. So it's a geographic presence. It's understanding who can help you in your ESG journey, because it doesn't have to be an individual company. It's more about who can work with you in a landscape. It's about also understanding how do you want to engage them and what do you want for them? So it's a different type of communication. But if you start a co-creation process, you have to really be understanding of what you are willing to show when you start the process and being clear about the intent, but understanding that you will not on what is the outcome of this, because that's the beauty of a co-creation process. And often I see a lot of companies bring their usual suspects. So they bring to co-creation process the people that they like working with. And it's great and it's a good start. And no one has to go around transformative stakeholder engagement and co-creation. But if you are willing to really expand your product and your services and how you're showing up as a company, when you bring a more diverse group of stakeholders and even maybe competition or people that you not normally kind of engage, but have an interest based on your mapping, that's where the magic happens, because you start really enriching that understanding of how can you add value and impact, because it's not just your linear thinking of what you know how to do. You bring other expertise, you bring other reality, other perspective, other skills. And then what is important is you all agree about what is your co-shared vision. So what's emerging from you are wanting to work together, and then allow, and you all going to try to think that I'm like just pouncing our services, but allow someone to facilitate this process for you, because then you stand as a normal stakeholders within your own ESG journey. And what happened what happened when that take place is innovation, is creativity. And what we've seen is that it kind of starts changing your product and your services and your positioning with the market. And then you start also doing bundling of services with others that you never thought about. And so it's not about just your ESG journey from a CSI or CSR perspective. It's about developing offerings that are relevant to other people that you never thought about. So I'm going to stop here, even if I get a lot to say.
I've got to say, I love this.
You've raised a number of issues there. So the other issue that we really have to think about in systemic planning and thinking about is diversity and inclusion, to get different ideas, but also that it's not easy, right? Because it's a different way of doing things. And if you go to your exco and say, I need you to be here for a whole day to talk about with stakeholders about what we could potentially do and co-create, they'll probably, like throw their hands up in horror. So it's not an easy process, but if you start small and get some wins, you can show people the value of doing it. Then it can really give you exponential value from that. So, sorry, Nicola, do you want to add something on that?
No, I was just enjoying Wendy's passion.
Marie, yes.
Marie's passion. Happy to listen.
Wendy, can I say something?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, just adding actually to the whole flow of the conversation so far. And what is important in these, when organizations look at this, is also to always look back at themselves. And I think there's so much, comes back to the egos and all that stuff that we spoke about. And this is the way the system is. And these are our stakeholders, as Mari said, okay, it's those. But look back at ourselves and look at who are we not speaking to? What are we not hearing? What are we not aware of? And if the system has to be new, if we want to co-create something new, how would we need to change everything we do potentially? And how, so to change a system, you need to change the way people think. You need to change the consciousness, the awareness. So it's not just about changing this to get to the systems change. We need to go down into people. We need to start thinking differently. We need to start looking at the world differently. And we need to see the people that we didn't see before, like Nicola said, the people that are left out of the equation. Example now, let's say the socio-political thing happened in Kenya. We don't, in the political world, they don't take the youth seriously. But now the youth are saying, well, here we are. The youth have now, I think, thankfully, those are the good things. Some of the systems were, we don't listen to the youth. Those were the stories we were told. Now the youth are just actually stepping up. And the older generation are going to have to say, oh, okay, there's a lot of these young people around. And they're actually challenging us. And that's what needs to come is the openness to be able to say, okay, maybe what I'm doing is not the right thing anymore. It's not the best thing anymore. And to move also from all our headspace down to like, what is really happening in the broader perspective of the world and what it could be? What is the better place that we can be?
No, thank you for that, Sharon. That's a great intervention. I mean, I think absolutely it's about questioning where you are all the time because the world is changing so fast. If you keep on that same way of thinking, you're never going to innovate. And you could be going down a very dangerous path. So that brings us nicely into both you and Marie have mentioned innovation. So, Nicola, do you want to talk a little bit about the role of innovation in all of this and how this links to maybe some of the tools that people can use to get these leaders that we've been talking about or decision makers to think differently?
Yes. But first, I just wanted to give you a practical example on stakeholder engagement. Before we get into innovation. You'll find stakeholder engagement always sits right at the bottom and it never has an appropriate budget. And very seldomly do companies take stakeholder engagement seriously. Everybody will do a map and, prioritize the stakeholders, but very seldomly are you actually looking at each stakeholder and understanding what their key requirements are, what their key concerns are, and then developing responses from a company's perspective to those concerns and requirements, not only developing responses, figuring out what communication platform you should use to talk to them, okay, how often you should talk to them, who within the company should talk to them, and what the cultural sensitivities are that you should be aware of. That's a basic approach to stakeholder engagement that people must think about. It must be done properly because it's so easy to hurt yourself by engaging stakeholders incorrectly. You can hurt your reputation, get all sorts of loads of stuff on social media that you really don't want to deal with if you don't spend time and effort thinking about your stakeholders. Onto the innovation angle. That's quite hard, but not really in ESG. Okay, because it all, from my perspective, revolves around the tech you're going to use. If you're looking at innovation, anybody can say we're on a net zero journey. Let me tell you, it's almost impossible to get there. It's extremely difficult. So the innovation that is needed, mostly from a financial perspective, CFOs are not keen on me saying, here, will you invest a couple of million on putting solar rooftop on the panel? So what we need to demonstrate from the innovative point of view, again, comes down to what are the benefits? Are you doing the right feasibility modeling to understand how you will bring the innovative green tech into your business? And I loved what Marie and Sharon were saying. The innovation comes into, we've got a quadrant model where essentially you're looking at all the rules, the structures, and the processes in product run. It's the housekeeping. Then you begin your stakeholder dialogues. And through your stakeholder dialogues with everybody within the entire run of your business, from shareholders all the way to suppliers, That allows you to really start creating innovative products, innovative go-to-market strategies, innovative branding ideas, and in access to much cheaper forms of capital. So that's how I believe you should use innovation from an ESG perspective with your stakeholders. Make sure you have all your housekeeping and legal things in order. You're obeying all your environmental laws and regulations. You're talking to your stakeholders, and through that, and through the correct financial modeling on any serious capex that you might be doing, you're getting into a quadrant where ESG is really adding value. New products, new services, new routes to market, new ways of doing things. That's for me the innovation on that front.
Thank you. Sharon or Marie, do you want to add something on innovation?
Not on innovation, but I mean, I suppose it's. I just would like to reflect on one thing that Sharon said, is that's all right around the self from an ESG and organizational perspective, and link it to innovation, actually, if that's all right, Wendy, just very quickly.
Sure, of course.
I think Sharon, that's a super important point, and why I wanted to reflect on it is because I've just been having like 2 engagements over the last 2 weeks around this. And so organization going through their ESG or sustainability strategy and actually looking at what they have achieved and being completely honest to say we haven't achieved what we wanted and why. Then they start going through a system change assessment of why they haven't. One of the things they found out is that their governance structure and their stakeholder engagement is not fit for purpose to be transformative. What do I mean by this is, as Nicola was mentioning, is they're just not applying the principle of the engagement process to be transformative and to allow a transformative process. And so they are starting now a questioning around their own culture as an organization. They are questioning the governance system in terms of where do we give the place to our stakeholders? Where we give the place to communities, to indigenous communities? I saw a reference to it in the chat box, to the voices that are not there. And how do we start shifting? And Nicola, you used that word power. And how they start shifting influence and power to others. But the reality is, and I think we have to be completely honest about this, it's not for every company. And it requires a very strong and intentional leader and leadership team and board to want to do that. And so in terms of the innovation, Wendy, I think what is important is don't start from scratch as a company to do that in your ESG, because that might just not fly. But I think it starts with experimenting around this on one product or on one area. And just as you say, I think, Wendy, you mentioned that, is innovate around this and show then back to the board and the leadership team what was added value, what did you learn, and what is the potential then of scaling. So, but it starts with you wanting to challenge yourself on the way and on how you're doing this. And it's all about more the process, actually, than the product and services to start.
Thank you. Totally agree. Sharon, did you want to add anything on innovation?
Just something short. Yeah, it's we need to get to the space of innovation to create a space and a world that's going to be different to this chaos that we continue to do, and it needs to start here. I was just thinking, we're talking about ESG, and I'm thinking, like, how do we think about ESG individually, and what would a conversation be like in a company if it was first a personal question in your role as personal and work? How does ESG fit into your thinking? And also, actually was in a talk last night where a young guy said transformation happens when you take responsibility for yourself. And I think it's a big thing that we also need to learn is we need to lose the belief of Superman's coming. Superman's not coming. Superman is us. And unless we step up, and that is for every single person in the organization, and we need to let people need to feel that empowerment, be able to speak. So that comes to the leadership structures where, you know, you can't speak to the boss. That kind of stuff has to stop. And then innovation is, we obviously learn from history and how things have done, and we need to learn to get to that next point, that we don't just extract from the past, but that we need to sit in this space and say, okay, this is what we've learned, and this is the reality that we're in. Now, what might be possible to get to a different space? And the innovation is almost like thinking from the future rather than thinking from what we know.
Yeah, that's so important. And I mean, for human beings, that's so hard because we normally think based and have biases based on our past, right? So that's why I was asking about the tools, because using things like teaching people systems diagrams to understand causality, ask questions like what if, what else, you know, so that you expand out your thinking, scenarios, those kinds of things, so that people don't take decisions in a simple world, but in this more complex and complicated world. So I think that's such an important point. Thank you for bringing that up. And also the issue around leadership, which is at all levels in the organization, which I think is also really, really important. I wanted us to move on a little bit to start talking about how do we know if we've been successful in implementing systemic change. You know, it's nice to talk about it, and we have all these nice things, and how do we actually measure it? Nicola, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, it's not easy, and it doesn't happen over a couple of months. When you're measuring this, you need to look at and generally it's about 2 years before you're going to get the data out. So you need to make a long-term commitment to this change, because anything that's large scale does take time to, the data come out. For example, how many training programs do your employee base need before you can start measuring the productivity improvements you're getting? It's not going to happen within 2 or 3 months. It is going to take you a little bit longer. Other elements of success, let's think, if you look at the social aspect, little things like, for example, we were working at a factory up in Nigeria that was making beds. And they were having lots of issues with the community that was vandalizing the factory all the time. Lots of employees were late for work. And it was just about looking at this issue and thinking, what's going on? And the only solution was we built a bridge over the river so that kids could get to school on time, that people could get to work easily. And all of a sudden, the vandalism problem goes away. But you have to engage and understand. So your success in that is not going to be overnight. It does take a few months before you start seeing the numbers coming in. Design the data system so that makes it easy for you to gather the data to prove your success, because you're going to need to prove it. And particularly if you're going to get more cash from the CEO to do more and more that you'd like to do. Get the data. And the data is very hard to do. There are lots of new systems and tools you can use. But really, for me, the data is about educating people why data is important. So I can't give you lots of successful things, immediately. Take the time to look at how your breakages and your theft and your training programs are adding value to your cost lines and to your revenue lines. That's really your success measures, put it that way.
And Nicola, how do you measure those social issues that we were talking about earlier that are so important for Africa? Because oftentimes that's not very data-driven, or it's soft data, it's people's opinions. Yeah.
You do have to do surveys and you have to go and collect the data. Obviously, to calculate impact, we're using a lot of impact multipliers. I don't think the impact multipliers are that great for all parts of Africa. But you need to use them to create all our traditional impact reports that we do use. But if you're looking and you're doing, let's take a big company that has a very large retail base that works across Africa, let's say distributing goods to all the retailers. You have to go in there and do a study about, are my employees earning a living wage? What is happening to the education levels of the children in the communities that are close to our premises? Are we paying the living wage? Are we helping people understand that they shouldn't be doing this and using credit cards or whatever? And you slowly begin to measure your education levels of the communities around your operations, things like that. That's how you measure community.
Thank you.
To order.
Thanks very much. Marie or Sharon, do you want to answer on the measurement issue? Or any thoughts to add there?
Definitely, because this is a big one, and I think the measurement issue of ESG is one set that is as data framework and has a lot of element. But now I'm more interested about how do we demonstrate that we are having the system change that we were intending, and then that one I think Nicola and I and Sharon and you, Wendy, we need to sit down, because there is a lot of like issue around this, and so I'm going to try to make it quite practical, in the sense that we have worked with company where obviously people want data. That's a reality. We want data because data is able to inform decision, and it's able to also, it's easy to put it, people understand it, and I completely agree with this. But there are elements of system change where mass system change through the ESG approach is about improving agency of small-scale farmer. So I can tell you how much farmer we have impacted, but to tell you the story about how they improve the agency, it's not a number, it's a story. And that story then will give you more number, because it will tell you they were able to engage and negotiate price with the sugar factories that were there. They were supposed to engage with and collaborate and create cooperatives. They were supposed to have access to finance. They were supposed to have more confidence in developing new products. They had skill that enabled them to do, and there is a whole story there that has no number. And my story about this is it got killed by many people in companies. And that's the reality, because I couldn't put a number on it. And they were like, that is too complicated. And I think at the moment, we're having a bit of a pull and push, because ESG is very intensive on number, which I understand. But if we are taking a transformative and system change approach, we need to allow a bit of experimentation about how do we demonstrate that long-lasting impact. So I can create a job. The job is there for 2 years. I created a job, is there for 2 years. I created the ability of someone to either be an entrepreneur or to have the ability to look and feel confident to look for a job once, but not just once, 2, 3, 4 times. That's slightly different. And so I think and especially in South Africa, we're very quick at creating a project that creates jobs. It's not that people get new jobs, it's just the project creates jobs. What is interesting is how do you build the skill and the capacity and the confidence of people to be able to then look for more jobs. And that's just one of the examples. So to me is how do we look at new indicators and experiment and exchange and learn around this in additional to the one that we have? How do we create story between the different indicators that Nicola, because I love the example of the breach, Nicola. I think that's a perfect one of system change. The one indicator is a breach, but there are so many other numbers and other systemic stories that are coming out at that one breach that are as important. And to me, that's a perfect, actually, example of system change. It's like you found your leverage point, you build it, and through that changed your entire system. And I agree with Nicola around the time frame. And I think it's quite important when you start your journey, and if you want to push and be more system change approach in USG, is to be pragmatic and realistic, you know, and just bring one, bring two, have a go at it. But a lot of work needs to be done. So I'm looking forward for this community of practice to get together and just experiment.
Yeah. Sharon, anything to add?
I really add that yes, it's a hard one, and I love the idea of the stories, because that is what we are as Africans. We love storytelling. Much of our history is in storytelling, and yeah, I think we need to stretch our vision in terms of what time means. I think it's very much the message that we've got from people that we've worked with on the continent that have managed to start from nothing and to create a new system or structure supporting communities. They just say it takes time. This one person, once she could tell us a story, she said, I've started 10 years ago. It takes time. And then, yeah, let me just rather just leave it at that. You know, what is that question that's chasing us to answer the thing now? But that's what corporates want before they fund anything, etc., etc. We need to kind of broaden the way we just look at life, I think, and the reality that we're creating.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, your analogy to, the storytelling is really important. I agree. And I don't know if any of you follow Dave Snowden's work, the Cunniff and sense-making framework. And there, in his work, he looks at and he doesn't look at measuring. He looks at how do we get less stories like this and more stories like that. That's how we measure the change from what people are telling us on the ground. And people are sometimes uncomfortable with that because they want to put a number onto something. But he was very much like, we're just moving from stories like this to stories like that. So,
and I think we've got there are many very wonderful stories of things changing in South Africa and Africa.
yes.
I think one huge leverage point could be is finding those stories and getting them told.
Mm.
And that in itself will energize more change.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. So I want us just to address some of the questions that we've been getting in the Q&A. So the first one is about how do we integrate into other divisions like SHEC? And yeah, that's really important. I think Nicola was talking about that, about how, because ESG is so broad and it's just about every. So Nicola, do you want to take that one?
Yes, with pleasure. SHEC is an incredibly important element in any ESG program because it's got the S program. SHEC is about ensuring that you've got all the safe processes in place, that your equipment is checked and maintained properly. So when you're creating your ESG, this is management system, all your SHEC elements are going to fit deeply in that management system, the ESG management system, and you are going to be putting data out of all the SHEC type of principles, all your lost time injury frequency rates, all of that traditionally comes from your SHEC departments. The SHEC departments are monitoring waste control and pollution levels. So SHEC is actually a vital element within the whole ESG bundle. All departments, one must understand that sustainability affects absolutely everyone in the C-suite, from the sales function to the IT guys, to the HR guys. It is across the organization. It doesn't belong in a siloed function at all. It affects everyone. And every decision that is made about anything in a company needs to consider the principles of sustainability and what the company has put forward. So it never sits on its own. ESG happens across every division within a company, if I can say that.
Yeah, and it's implemented by everybody, not you, as the sustainability. Yeah. Thank you for that. There's also, in the interest of time, I see some other questions. I'll come back to them if I can, but there's one here that I really want to raise, and from Andrew, which talks about innovation in the circular economy, which is emerging more and more, and youth employment creation. And he's asking, how can we apply systemic change to tackle this challenge? So just a simple question. That's a really complicated question. Thank you, Andrew, for raising it. I think it's a really good one. Anybody want to tackle that?
I can maybe go on the. I mean, the circular economy in a way is based around system change. So this one, I feel like they almost embedded in it. But I'm more interested about the youth employment because I can give a proper example actually. So we were part of a big African process around youth opportunity in food system change. So food system in Africa is huge. It's linked to agriculture, but it's linked to other economic sector. And the challenge was to say, how does we make sure that the development of the food system in Africa is going to benefit and create opportunity for the youth? And what it means is a lot of the system change is very valuable in the planning process. And it's about planning in a world of complexity and uncertainty. So in terms of applying it, as one example is using, and I think someone used the word, is using foresight approach, which is a system change process also in terms of planning. So it's not planning with what you know, but it's planning with what you don't know, and planning using the extremity of what could happen. And what it does is it push you, and that's where you're bringing your stakeholder to help you to plan various scenarios and crazy scenario, probable but crazy, to help you to understand how the world could evolve. And especially when you plan for youth, planning for the youth today is almost too late. I mean, I don't mean to be like doom and gloom, but a sector is evolving, and if you want to change it, you need to understand how is it going to evolve, and how do I need to prepare the youth for it. And so when you do this planning and this planning process with a system change approach, through this process, it helps you to understand the different parts that are relevant for the youth, and what do you need from either a policy perspective, a technology perspective, a skill, an education, a banking, the different elements that will optimize the opportunity for the youth, and that help you to think in different ways and look at different leverage points. And when we did that, we did it with the youth. So we didn't just got all guys and women like us, we got the youth in the room to really get them to think and help us thinking through the planning. So I think using system change planning around ESG is a very powerful tool for you to also build a resilience and future-proof kind of strategy that can evolve and adapt.
Mm. And the scenarios you were saying, so important. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to add on to that question about the circular economy?
Yes.
Nicola.
There were a couple of years ago, there was a tender, and I'm talking many years ago, the tender that was cancelled by the government to formalize the waste pickers that work particularly in Johannesburg, and try and get them some sort of stability in income and pricing. Unfortunately, that was cancelled, which I thought was not the right move. So from a policy perspective, we need to make it easy and almost mandatory to encourage recycling of every kind of bit that we can. There are very few people who do recycling as a rule in Johannesburg. It doesn't happen. So it happens by companies who are going to landfills to pick things out, and that's not great. Encouraging the youth to jump in it may involve education facilities throughout our schooling systems. I mean, these are just ideas, but I really do think that this kind of thing needs to be driven from the top, from government, from policy and a regulatory approach. We can come in and add finance and add people in volunteerism to educate the youth, but I think it should be structured from the top when you're thinking about a circular economy. We can all do it in our companies, and we'll often bring a child to work day, but that's not enough. That's not dealing with youth. And I love Marie's idea about getting the youth to tell us what they think will be needed in the future.
Mm. Thank you so much. Sharon, you want to add anything?
Yeah, just the youth, as much as we talk about buy-in and getting people to saying what Nicola said, now we've got to speak to the youth to see what they need. The same way in a corporation, buy-in again sometimes can be a thing like you feel like I'm going to get the buy-in from the bottom up, but actually it's about going to the people and getting the creation, and they create the future. So I think for the youth, they are suffering the results of our poor systems that we've created. So, and the big thing that we need to move past, I think we need to think beyond just they must be employed. We must find a way to employ them. We need to empower people to employ themselves. We need to, and the thinking around systems change is very valuable in that. It's teaching people how to go through a process of, this is where I'm at, this is a possibility. How do I work with that to get to something which can possibly be a job for me, creating my own work, and maybe I'll employ a few others. It's, there's a lot of sort of more intangible things that we need to do with the youth. It's to change their belief system. It's to change them. Maybe we should just believe in them. That in itself could make a difference. Because the youth feel like they've been, left behind in our systems. But we need to build that confidence or belief in themselves that they are their own leaders and they can make this happen as well. I know it's not as easy as that, but
it's a nice segue into one of the other questions from Prakashna on SMMEs. So this kind of systemic change is difficult enough when you're a big organization. For SMMEs, it's even more difficult. And for big organizations to engage SMMEs in that system change is also quite difficult because they may have really long supply chains and many, many suppliers. Any of the, and then there's also a question around, how you're also engaging regulatory authorities to think like this. Any thoughts on that from anybody on the panel? SMMEs and regulatory authorities.
I think it's quite difficult for SMMEs to engage regulators. However, if any of the larger companies, there is constantly an engagement with the regulator in order to understand the issues that you have with implementing regulations. There's also multiple educational initiatives, particularly in Africa and very strongly in Kenya, where you're inviting the regulators into your training academies to teach them about the future movement, the future requirements of ESG and where it's going. So bring the regulators along on the ride with you. And if you're establishing that rapport and learning together, then when you have a problem as an SMME, there is no reason why you can't go and talk to the regulator to understand how they expect you to implement something that is really difficult for you as an SME, either from a size perspective, capacity perspective, finance perspective.
Thank you. Anyone else want to?
I was going to speak about ESG system change approach and SMMEs, not directly to the regulator. So I don't know if that's relevant. Sure. Just in terms of, and that's something I know that is a big topic around ESG and SMMEs and what does that mean and how we do it. And I think to me it's a very interesting element. So first of all is how do we bring that knowledge and that understanding early on in the incubator of SMMEs and startup, because that's something that's not there. So you're starting a business, a lot of incubators start with all the financial element, but there is very little on ESG, there is very little on future-proof your business, and there is very little on system change and how do you position yourself as a SMMEs. So that's my first topic. My first element is how do we make sure that all the support to SMMEs bring that element of ESG and system change and future-proofing SMMEs. Then the second point is how do we have, and that go back to our stakeholder engagement and co-creation, is how do we change the relationship, the power between big business and SMMEs around ESG? And to me, it's understanding the role and influence of big business to see how do I bring SMMEs in my proposed value. So not just how do I skill them, but how do I bring them? How do I bring them in my sphere of influence and power and give them more influence and power? And what I mean with that, so let me be completely blunt, for example. I love to be challenging a bit. So for example, Nicola is not EY, but you're a big company. And I am a very small micro enterprise. And it's a question of how do you put SMMEs and big company together to actually start developing approach that doing it together is really much more impactful and transformative than if we were doing it separately. So I think there's a lot of potential on looking for partnership, not only public-private, but big business and small business together and challenge each other and grow together in a different way, more as growing as an ecosystem than growing individual as business. So that I think also the ESG impact at a broader ecosystem level.
Thank you. if there are no other inputs, then I think that brings us to the end of our webinar. From what I've heard, I think the discussion has been a really, really challenging one. So thank you so much to the panelists. We've sort of tried to delve into this issue of systemic changes needed in today's world, and ESG, because it's cross-cutting, it's an essential part of ESG, but that it's not easy, it's people-based, and it's going to take time, and we're going to have to make small incremental steps, because ultimately we have to change culture, and that can take an extremely long time. And we're going to have to change the way in which our mindsets, and that's going to require new skills and competencies in our organizations, but also in the way in which we engage with stakeholders. And the World Economic Forum has this wonderful, I think it was written by the head of WEF, where they talk about stakeholder capitalism, where you see stakeholders as a value to you rather than, as Nicola was saying, a little checkbox that you just have to go and say, oh, we spoke to them. But they do actually add value to it. And you guys have raised so many issues around that, diversity and inclusion, innovation. And that helps us at the end of the day to be more sustainable and improves our license to operate. And so it's something that I think is really going to only increase in importance in sustainability debates as we go forward. So thank you so much for that really rich and interesting discussion. You're all very passionate about it, as am I. And so thank you so much. And we hope to see you all at the ESG conference.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll hand back to Shannon.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Yes, I really enjoyed that discussion. So thank you to everyone for joining. We appreciate everybody's time. It's been a pleasure sharing the topic of systemic change and ESG with you. Before we wrap up, I'd like to extend my gratitude to our moderator, Wendy Poulton, and guest speakers, Marie Paramon-Gurney from Sculpture, Sharon van Skalkwijk from Ubuntu Lab Institute, and Nicola White from EY Parthenon for an engaging panel discussion. They've all contributed to making this webinar a success. Thank you to EY for their support in making this webinar possible. And if you have any further questions or would like to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out to us via email at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. And if you're interested in hearing more about the ESG Africa conference, please visit their website at www.esgafricaconference.com. With that, I'd like to bid you all farewell. Thank you for your time and goodbye.